There's a man I know. He's 59 years old, and he is going to die. We're all going to die, of course, but this man can count his remaining days on all 10 fingers and only 4 toes. This man has also been counting his final days for the last 20 years. That's over 7,200 X's on the calendar, and now just 14 left to go. Imagine that for a second. Knowing the exact date and time of your death. But that's not all. This man knows the where, the why, and the how. And most importantly, the by whom. Because you see, on November 30th, by order of the state of Oklahoma, Phillip Dean Hancock is scheduled to be executed by means of lethal injection. I know Phil, because for the last 10 months, I've been his chaplain, his spiritual care advisor that will be in the room with him during the execution. And despite all of those certainties of that day, I have never, ever in my entire life been so uncertain about what that day is going to ask of me. The story actually begins back in 2015 when I had the bright idea to host a podcast about death. The hypothesis of the adventures of Memento Mori was that if I could face my mortality, then that would enable me to live the most deliberate life possible. Memento Mori, carpe diem. And so I set out to prove that theory and face my mortality in public with sound effects. The funny thing about death, or at least hosting a podcast about death, is that the more that you think you know, the more you realize you don't know that much. And so what started off as an innocent intellectual curiosity turned into a blown-out existential scavenger hunt that was going very smoothly for about 3 years. And then things took a dramatic spiritual left turn. And her name is Reverend Trudy Hirsch Abramson. I was interviewing Trudy about Buddhist beliefs in the afterlife. And after a very lovely, long conversation, she looks at me and says, "You know, you would make a good chaplain." It's important to know that besides being a Zen master of the White Plum Sangha, Trudy was also a chaplain instructor. And I don't know if chaplain recruitment numbers were down that year. But, so when I said to her, there was one fundamental flaw to her idea. And I said, me, a chaplain, I can't because I don't believe in God. And Trudy says, well, neither do I. The question is, what do you believe in? Why don't you sit with that and let it stew? And so when the Zen master tells you to sit and stew, you sit and stew. The funny thing about beliefs is that they're not facts. Beliefs require you to commit to something without evidence. And that's a hard concept to accept, especially for a skeptic. I like facts. I love proof. Leaps of faith, not my strong suit. But sure enough, I sat and I stewed. And then the next thing you know, the breadcrumbs started to appear. Then the breadcrumbs turned into bread loaves. And then the next thing you know, I was sending out an application to seminary school to become a chaplain. The job of a chaplain is to provide spiritual care to care seekers within a secular institution, such as hospitals, colleges, universities, and prisons. And so I learned a lot in my theology school, but one thing that they didn't have on the curriculum was spiritual care. And so for my chaplain internship at Bellevue Hospital during a global pandemic, never had I ever felt so uncertain about what that moment was going to ask of me. I did, however, know what I believed in at that point. All that sitting and stewing led me to humanity. I believe that every person has the potential to be and do good beyond themselves. My religion was humanism. Humanism is a life stance that empowers people to live fulfilled lives using rational thinking, dignity, ethical responsibility to each other, to our communities, and to the planet. Sounds good. And it is good. But bridging the gap between humanism and spirituality was left up to me. And so there I was, a non-theist chaplain at Bellevue Hospital with a major case of imposter syndrome, trying to hopefully not get caught, that I didn't know what I was doing. And this went on for a couple weeks until the dots connected. And this happened one night in a room in the forensic unit. And in Bellevue, forensic means that's where the incarcerated from Rikers were transferred to get medical treatment. So I walk up to the room, knock on the door. Young man in the bed looks up at me. I take that as a sign to take 2 steps in, very nervously. And then I gave him my spiel at the time. Hi, I'm Chaplain Devin, your spiritual care support. May I offer you a meditation or a prayer? And this young man, we'll call him Mr. Jones, immediately says, yes, you can pray for my hemorrhoids. I laughed too, because I thought it was a joke, until I realized that it wasn't. See, Mr. Jones then went on to tell me that at Rikers, they weren't giving him any treatment. And so to get treatment, he resorted to swallowing razor blades. Now, he says, they will listen to me. And so Mr. Jones goes on and says, you can pray, but it probably won't do any good because God doesn't listen to me anyway. He goes on to say that he actually believed that God went out of his way to punish him. And then he looks at me and says, how could I be expected to love a God that doesn't love me back? Mind you, I'm still in the doorway with absolutely no idea of how to respond. Do I tell him that he's wrong and that God does love him? Do I let him know that I'm actually not a Christian? And then in that moment of fear and crisis, it hit me. He's already told me how to respond. And so I bowed my head and we prayed for his hemorrhoids. Then we prayed for his girlfriend. Then we prayed for his brother. And then we spent about 20 minutes talking about all the suffering he's had in his life. Then we talked about all the love in his life. And then for another 20 minutes, together, we just wrestled with his doubt. No judgment, no analysis, no proselytizing. The only thing I needed to believe in that room was in his humanity. So that's when things clicked for me. I realized that spiritual care is the art of story listening. Spiritual care is about getting in the patient's boat and understanding how to contextualize their suffering and pain. So in divinity school, we learned that in crisis, people tend to make sense of the world through religion and through mythology and through symbolism. And then at Bellevue, I learned that spiritual care is about helping people contextualize pain to what is sacred to them. But the funny thing about spiritual care is that once something clicks, there's still something else you need to learn. And I learned that real fast on death row. Religiously, Phillip Dean Hancock considers himself to be an anti-theist. And why would an anti-theist need spiritual care, you ask? Is that's because one of the things you should know about Phil is that besides being able to recite Dante and Blake and every lyric to every Slayer song ever written, is he also has the Bible practically memorized. And so like Mr. Jones at Bellevue, Phil sees his pain as evil and sees it through the lens of religion. And so for months, every day on our phone calls, he would just recite scripture. Better than any minister I've ever heard on a Sunday morning. Phil recites scripture. And I'm there taking notes, trying to figure out what he's really saying. Months this went on. Until finally, I just got exhausted. Exhausted of not knowing what to do. Exhausted of feeling like this was way over my head. And to be honest with you, I didn't feel that I was helping him in any way prepare for an execution. So I called Zen Master Trudy, and I asked her for advice. And she says, just ask Phil what he wants you to do. It's that simple. So I did. I asked Phil, and his response was immediately, show me something real, show me something true. In 2 weeks from today, Phil will die, technically murdered. And the thing that I can show him, the thing that is real that I can show him, is that I am uncertain. I am unsure what that day is going to ask of me, and I am definitely unsure what it's asking of him. But I also can show him that I've befriended my uncertainty, because there's power in befriending your uncertainty because it keeps you open. It keeps you open, and it makes you stand in attention. Because the realest thing is in life and in death is uncertainty. Compassion is the truest thing that I can show Phil in spiritual care. If empathy is walking a mile in someone else's shoe, compassion is walking a mile with them in step, holding their hand. Compassion doesn't ask you to understand. It just says, hey, show up with your heart open. Show me something real. Show me something true. Befriending uncertainty, leading with compassion is not easy, doesn't make the fear go away, and it does require you to take a leap of faith. But if you do it, I promise you this, there's magic in it, even if you're a skeptic like me. There's a man I know His name is Phil Hancock. Thank you.